Welcome to another episode of ACRP TV, our Spotlight On series. Today we're talking about what will the clinical trial enterprise look like a year from now, which is a big question. We're going to look at a couple different areas. We're here with Doug Peddicord, who's the Executive Director of the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Nice to see you, Michael.
And I appreciate you wore a tie. I'm very impressed. I feel a little underdressed, but I thank you very much.
Well, I can say this is perhaps the second time in the last 3 months or so.
Kind of a novelty these days. Yeah, tie sales must be really declining right now. All right, let's jump in. I thought you and I would talk maybe, talking about what will the clinical trial enterprise look like a year from now. Obviously, big question, and maybe look at it in 3 areas, roughly speaking: technology, in terms of regulation, and then maybe a little bit about diversity in the workforce with patients and staff. So with that overview, can maybe talk about, where you see things a year from now on the technology side, decentralized trials and remote monitoring, that kind of thing. But, first, let me ask you to talk a little bit about ACRO. I'm throwing a lot at you here. I apologize. Talk a little bit about ACRO first.
No worries. Okay. So ACRO is trade organization, founded just about 20 years ago. Next year, 2021, will be our 20th anniversary. Originally a trade organization of CROs. In the last several years, actually, our membership is almost equally clinical research organizations and technology companies. Technology companies have become absolutely integral to the enterprise. They are not simply vendors of products. They are really embedded in the research enterprise at this point. And so we at ACRO felt that it was important to enlarge our tent. And so at this point, as I say, we're about half and half, clinical, full service, global clinical research organizations and global technology companies. So it's been a really interesting transition. And I will say one that is very much in keeping with what you and I are going to talk about this morning.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue. Let's talk about the technology side of clinical trials and where you see things, where you and I are speaking in June of 2020. This is like a time capsule for the future. Where do you see things a year from now, say?
Well, clearly, all of us are trying to figure out what the lessons learned are in the COVID-19 environment. We have all research sites, CROs, technology companies, and regulators have all pivoted pretty strongly in order to keep trials up and running. And so we've seen enormous use of technology to accomplish that, starting with telemedicine, remote visits, and the like, moving to, we had been making good progress toward risk-based monitoring. But I think now we are actually moving in the direction of risk-based quality management. That is to say, building a risk-based approach into everything from trial design through execution, through data monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. And then beyond that, again, we have been making some progress toward decentralized trials using technologies to, among other things, lessen burdens on patients. The average patient, the figure I've seen is that the average patient travels about 50 miles to get to a clinical research site. If we can reduce the number of visits to the clinical research site and use telemedicine and remote technologies in order to make things better, easier for the patient to participate, we think that will make participation easier. So we're moving in the direction of decentralized trials. I think the other thing that we are starting to move toward is really the use of real-world data and real-world evidence, so that we are tapping into, for instance, electronic health records. We're trying to begin to bring together the clinical care enterprise with the clinical research enterprise. Those have always existed in some ways in parallel, but never the twain shall meet. And I think what we would love to see is for the data that can be derived from clinical care, from patient visits to doctors, be used as part of clinical research. And again, that's actually that's a movement that requires adjustments by research sites, by CROs and technology companies, and by regulators. And again, what's been interesting now is that COVID-19 has been forcing a lot of this on us. I think it's going to continue. I think we will really use lessons learned, and in some ways make the changes to the enterprise that we were moving in the direction of, but with some luck, we really accelerated the change in paradigm.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the regulation side of it, because you've covered the technology side there nicely. On the regulatory side, obviously everyone has to work with FDA and other regulatory bodies, and it's always a little dangerous to go too public with any negative comments. Having said that, what I've been hearing from people, behind the scenes too, is that FDA and others are getting pretty high marks for being nimble during this time with COVID-19, in terms of encouraging decentralized trials and remote monitoring and other technologies. Do you see that going, where do you see that a year from now? Do you think we're going to keep that momentum?
So we completely agree, by the way, on the high mark side. FDA, EMA, and other regulators have, I think, done an extraordinary job of encouraging adaptation. And so we have nothing but good things to say about that. Now, my caution, I suppose, is that to some extent, the regulators have been saying, by the way, this regulatory flexibility is during the period of the public health crisis. And they do not state, but we are somewhat concerned that may suggest, we sort of return to the status quo ante at some point. And that, I think, would be a mistake. So I think the regulators, and we should mention both regulators and our industry as a whole. So our industry as a whole is pretty cautious.
Sure.
We tend to be risk averse. Sponsors, clinical research organizations, even sites to some extent, tend to be risk averse. We are exquisitely aware of how important the data is. And so anything that might threaten the data and threaten the experience of those patients providing data is something that we are in some ways reluctant. So the tension here is between the real potential for making major changes and significant changes, and at the same time being sure that we don't move away from the regulatory standards, nor that we spook, for lack of a better word, our own marketplace in terms of those changes. So that I think will be a tension that we're going to continue to see. I mean, I think that in the next year or so, there will be those who are sort of moving full speed ahead, who say, look at what we've learned. Look at how we can do this in other ways. And then there will be those on the other side who say, yeah, but I've got a drug that's really important, and I need to be absolutely sure that the regulator will be able to approve this drug in the end. And so, as I said, there'll be some tension, but I think our industry has lived with that kind of tension for a long time. But again, I think we're moving kind of quickly now.
Okay, so let's talk about the diversity issue. We've covered technology, we've covered regulatory. Diversity is extremely important, maybe the most important of all in many ways, both in terms of patient populations and the workforce. ACRP recently has done some initiatives to try to diversify both, really, but of late, especially the workforce. Where do you think we'll be as an industry? Hopefully we're moving in the right direction, but what do you see maybe a year from now in that area?
Yeah, I think this one, so this one is the one that is not really amenable to a technology fix. This one is the one that also doesn't really count on regulatory flexibility. Regulators have looked for much greater diversity in clinical trials for a long time. I'm hopeful that, so we've looked at, or we're starting to look at, we at ACRO, are really starting to look at kind of all the parts of the enterprise and the issue of diversity, and doing that with really, obviously within the context today of the concern for social justice and social equity. Mm-hmm. You know, we've all recognized for a long time that African American and minority patients are underrepresented in clinical trials. We should recognize as well that African American and minority populations are similarly underrepresented within the clinical research workforce and among clinical investigators. And so from our perspective, you know, all of these are sort of multi-determined in regard to causes. But I think where we as an industry really need to put some attention is on the clinical research workforce and on clinical investigators. I think the patient piece, while important, is a really big chunk to bite off. It is one that I think a number of stakeholders have tried to address over the years. And we've made some, but not nearly enough progress. I do think, though, that with the leadership of organizations like ACRP, I think we have to make it clear that clinical research as a career is in fact a diverse opportunity. It's an opportunity for nurses and physicians and medical technicians and the like to both participate and to help facilitate the participation of their communities. And I think that's really an important thing. So while as I say, this is one that I think really relies largely on the industry. I think this is not technology, this is not the regulators. So my hope, Michael, is that in the next year or two, that organizations like ACRP, like ACRO, like the National Medical Association, like the historically Black colleges and university nursing schools and the like, will really make some genuine efforts to address the continuing underrepresentation in the workforce. I don't know, maybe we should talk in a year or two, see how we're doing. But it strikes me that this is one that if we're not going to recognize the need to address this issue now, I can't imagine when we're going to.
We've been speaking here with Doug Peddicord. He's the Executive Director of the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. This has been ACR TV Spotlight on what will the clinical trial enterprise look like a year from now. Doug, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Michael, thank you. And my best to everybody. Please stay safe.